spend as much money as you want. We're winning, right? We're winning
Yeah.
or you're all fired, right?
Kelsey Moser is the previous head of coaching staff of EG. She has a great deal of experience in professional play, everything from being an esports journalist to an analyst to a coach both in the LCS and LEC, as well as casting in the LPL. In this episode of the LS Show, we talk about the behind the scenes of coaching in EG,
We drastically downgraded between spring and summer, not because of performance, but because of budget, which is pretty obvious right now.
coaching in North America,
There's always, the fraud coach or the coach who doesn't really know about the game or the coach.
the failures of the LCS orgs,
If the LCS has failed at something, it is kind of differentiating our goals from team to team because
and the future of Academy.
the gap between Academy and LCS closed considerably.
So you most recently were a coach for EG in the LCS team, and even before that, you had worked with developing talent on EG and 100 Thieves. And back in 2016, back when you still worked on the Score Esports, you actually published a video talking about why the LPL is no longer clear number two. And one of the things you pointed out was their coaching structure and how sometimes they bring in coaches that aren't fit for what the players actually need, and that different players have different, needs for a coaching structure. The LCS the past few years has really invested into that. You have C9 with their infamous, systems, NRG with their, 115 coaches. And they just won the split. Obviously, you didn't have enough time to really develop your own coaching structure. I know it was pretty quick. You only had one
Right.
split on EG, but would you say that, in your opinion, the coaching in North America is still lackluster? Is it efficient? Is it effective in developing players and teams?
I would say that there's good and bad points to coaching in pretty much every region. Pretty much at this point, from a lot of accounts and a lot of conversations I have with people behind the scenes, there's always, the fraud coach or the coach who doesn't really know about the game or the coach who's always good at handling personalities and managing situations. There's the coach who knows too much about the game and knows too little about personalities and situations. There's always those things in pretty much every single region. It's just human leadership skills and people who play video games and don't have backgrounds in other things. All those things always culminate. I would say that the coaching structure, in regards to the coaching structure at EG, I was head of coaching staff in spring as well. And so I would say that that system and that structure was a lot closer to kind of what I envisioned, which is like a head coach for both teams, an assistant coach for both teams, and then kind of a floating positional coach that helps with kind of both teams. That was more the structure that we had then. We drastically downgraded between spring and summer, not because of performance, but because of budget, which is pretty obvious right now.
Uh,
At this point, I don't mind saying that I told them not to publish that statement. At this point, it's just the way it is. But yeah, I think in regards to that structure, it's kind of the structure that I saw as more interesting. Obviously, for me, the most efficient coaching staff is the one that where no one is useless and no one is overworked, right?
mhm.
So the way that that works practically is more or less if there's someone who's good at a certain job, you hire them. There isn't always a situation where you're going to encounter someone who's good at a certain job. I think, for example, NRG has a situation where they specifically looked for ex pros in every role to have as positional coaches. And for the most part, the players they talked to spoke of most of the coaches as effective and useful to have. So, and then a lot of times, just because of the infrastructure and the nature of the sport, ex pros aren't always good at the coaching bit, and analysts aren't always good at the or like former coaches, people who've been coaches for a long time, don't always have the most adept game knowledge because you either get burnt out or you stop playing or you watch too much of a certain thing or overly index in a certain thing. It's good to have like a mix of all sorts of backgrounds. So I think that that's very valuable as well. Like for example, Croissants never really went pro. I think ThinkGuard has very minimal experience. So
Mhm.
having a balance between someone like Soaz, who is pro for a very long time, and then those types of coaches who are kind of more of your traditional coaching background. I say traditional as if league esports has been around for a while, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it is, I guess, to make a very long answer to that question, I would say that it's not ideal, but it's more or less probably never going to be ideal. And you always try to make your coaching staff as efficient as possible, right? So,
So I guess speaking to the efficiency, what do you see the coaching staff's goal in terms of developing players that are on a
right.
team?
Yeah, so obviously the goal of a team is always going to be different. And I think that's one thing that the LCS, if you ask me if the LCS has failed at something, it is kind of differentiating our goals from team to team because obviously the sexy answer is not all teams can be first place. And I feel like a lot of the times every team tried to brand themselves as we're going to win. And that was the image conveyed to the public. And when only one team wins every split, then the branding kind of fails a bit. So I think there was a lot more indexing and a lot more honesty that could have been at least done internally, maybe, in terms of the goals of the team. So if your goal is we're going to develop one really strong core piece to take into next year, right? Maybe that's a goal a team could have. Perhaps your goal is we're going to set up a team to work really well around a specific star player. And we want to really showcase that player. We want to win MVP, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe the goal of a team is we're going to make worlds, right? Which is a very different goal. And then from that perspective, you would just want the team to function extremely well enough to qualify. And then, of course, if you want to win it all, you have to constantly be inspecting every little flaw, every little thing, and then make sure you're structuring your goals every week to get to a point where everything is improving. So there's very different ways that you can set up a roster from that perspective. So it really depends on what the goal is, which sort of has to come from upper management. Upper
Mm-hmm.
management can come in and say, um, which has happened multiple times in LCS history. There is no object, spend as much money as you want. We're winning, right? We're winning
Yeah.
or you're all fired, right? That has happened multiple times in LCS history. So I would say that there's that type of situation. And then maybe the management comes in with we're not spending as much money this year, and that gets conveyed to the GM, and the GM kind of has to craft what the goal is from that point. Or maybe the marketing team has some say in certain teams in terms of what the goal should be based on the budget limitations assessed by the staff, right? So very frequently you'll have a number given by upper management that the upper management doesn't really understand what kind of results they can get, right? With the number they're given, so they kind of have to trust the GM or the coaching staff to tell them, okay, this is how much money you can give me. This is the results that we can kind of expect. And then you go back to upper management and they say, wait, only that, here, have more money. Or maybe they come back and they say, okay, reasonable, but maybe you can push a little bit harder. And then you have to stay firm and say, no, no, this is this is the results you can expect. So it's really the back and forth there. And then you build your coaching staff from there, usually is the way that I would think of envision structuring a team with those goals in mind. And then you use the coaches as kind of scouts um, because very few teams have separate scouts from coaches. Coaches usually are called upon to scout in the off season. And then you use your coaches as scouts to build the team based on the limitations that you have. So it's very kind of top down in terms of how the goals are set. Yeah.
Okay. So when you do have a team and you're set up, how do you identify like what do we start working on? Is it like you said, you find whatever goal you have and maybe say, okay, we're going to develop Jojo Pin to win MVP this season and work around that.
Sure.
I mean, you came in with in summer obviously with the budget cuts and whatnot. Not many people had expectations for that roster.
Right.
And I mean, you guys were like 6-1 at some point, and you finished third in the standings, if I'm not mistaken. So
Yeah.
I'm
Mhm.
assuming you guys like overshot what you guys were aiming for. So is it just like okay, we'll go? Everybody's gonna play around, our star player, or what did you guys do at EG?
I think we didn't necessarily have the goal of everyone going to play around JoJo Pion. To be completely honest, I have to give a lot of credit to JoJo in general, just because I think most people saw the form he was in spring, and even JoJo has said and will say in spring was probably one of his that was his probably his worst split in the LCS, even his rookie split, right?
Hmm.
in terms of his overall performance and what he expects of himself. And he just worked really, really hard in the off season, spent like, an entire month in Korea, really grinded, really studied VODs, really kind of improved himself. And kind of saw himself as taking the responsibility of like inspired in terms of a lot of leadership and things like that, and just really pushed himself to get to that point. So I would say the form that JoJo was in from spring to summer was a surprise even for staff, right? So it wasn't like we came into spring and summer and said we're going to build a team around JoJo being the star and getting MVP of the league, right? We didn't have that kind of goal in mind. But it was definitely an idea of obviously we know JoJo is the piece we're going to retain. So what pieces complement him and what can we do to make the best roster with the pieces that we can get that can work together well and can kind of like punch above its weight in terms of the budget that we were offered, which I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about the strict budget numbers, but like in terms of budget 1 to 1, our goal was like kind of make playoffs comfortably and go from there, right? So I think that that was probably in the planning phase what the goal was for the roster, and in terms of the overall execution phase, when we started to see the player pieces that were available, when we started to see how the pieces played together, maybe we had higher expectations after that. But in an initial planning phase, right, we had very, very modest goals. So that's fair to say.
Okay. So I guess, leading from there, you had modest goals. You realized you guys were,
Yeah.
shooting above it, and you started raising the bar, and then you start faltering. And
Right.
what do you do as a coaching staff when you realize like you're making all these mistakes? Is it let's really hone in? Like how do you structure practice when things are going difficult? Is it do you look at, maybe the LPL LCK and try to change things up, or do you try to reinvest in what's working? Like how do you go about that?
So it's a very kind of collaborative process, right? I think it's fair to say that a lot of people can see the flaws before the results start to wane, right? So you're always actively working on things and how things can improve. I think obviously, even though, the goal wasn't initially let's win the whole thing, once we started performing well, we thought, okay, maybe we can. And then that was something that we started discussing and looking at. But of course, I think we started indexing in a lot of different things, and maybe part of the weirdness from like towards the end of the season was us trying to go back to what just worked really well initially, which was, you know, mid jungle 2v2, self-sufficient bot lane, like these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that those were where was kind of the process. There's always a lot of grasping at straws, and your job as a coach is to kind of keep everyone focused on a singular goal. And you can kind of argue whether or not Real Fun and I did a good job of that based on how we did. But a lot of times when you start out really, really strong as a team and you start having these unexpected pitfalls or pitfalls based on flaws that you knew existed, there ends up being a lot of, let's try this shiny thing in the corner. And
Mm-hmm.
the coach's job is a lot more about centralizing and coming up with a cohesive solution that doesn't make people feel like they're spinning or reeling in a specific direction. So,
That's interesting. I guess that brings me to like a methodology of coaching. So I did sports as growing up, and I had two
right,
different types of coaches for at least soccer or football. And there was
right,
the coach that would spend most of the time getting us to practice our mechanics, our passing, our dribbling, our corner kicks, our
right.
free
Yep,
kicks.
absolutely.
Yeah, so like CSing and that kind of stuff in league. And then his idea was that as long as you perfect the basic fundamentals that you're going to
Yep,
be using in every game, I can teach you the decision making through a few scrims here and there, and you'll be able to like apply the things because you already have the tools. Then I moved to a different team, and it was the exact opposite. We were doing a lot of scrims, a lot of 5v5s, 4v4s, and the idea of the coach was that as long as you can work on that decision making, I can trust that later on you can practice that corner kick. As long as you know
yep,
how to like set up the team, the actual like mechanics, you can learn that on your own. It seems historically in the LCS that we value scrims a lot more than like grinding or solo queue. I think even Fudge was saying solo
yeah,
queue might not be the best because and he does like 1v1s and whatnot. But you mentioned the Jojo Pune. He went to Korea. He really grinded. He focused on his mechanics, and that
yeah,
clearly translated to gameplay. So knowing that throughout the split, you have like a limited time. Ideally, you'd work on both, but do you value the scrim and like decision making and team play more than the actual mechanics? If so, like what is do you, a how do you balance the two if one is like more important than the other?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the team and the player. And it's nice that you mentioned that that was the trajectory your coaches took because I think it might be a little disorienting for you if you started out with a coach who's just only team play, no fundamentals, and then the next coach is just only fundamentals. Because I feel like that order of progression makes a lot more sense to me. So I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of it is depending on the level of the player, right? If the player is just really fumbling basic mistakes, then you focus a lot more on the basics. When you get to LCS level, ideally, you're not at that point. Obviously, not every player is like that in LCS, but in terms of the solo queue, I think it's important to kind of understand solo queue differences and how solo queue is in an A compared to other regions to really understand why there is this kind of debate among pro players. And the biggest thing for me is just if you're playing, soccer or whatever sports, soccer, football, basketball, whatever, um, if you're playing against better opponents, right, then you won't get away with lazy play as much, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'll always get punished for like bad passes or um, like less tight form, lack of basics, right? So if your opponents are really good, when you're playing solo queue, in theory, you should get punished for basic mistakes, right? But in NA, you're going to get punished for your basic mistakes way less frequently compared to when you're playing in the Korean server, right? Just because the quality of opponent that you can face there on a regular basis is just higher. And so when you're drilling basics, I always describe it as the difference between like trying to cut wood with a butter knife. You have to do it so many times over and over and over again. Whereas if you're in Korea, you cut wood with an axe, right? It's much more efficient, straight to the point. You only have to do it once. So I think that that's one of those things where it's just you're constantly trying to do the same movement that you would, but you're not getting punished for it. And so that actually can, in some cases, create bad habits, right? Rather than improve your play to just constantly grind solo queue like that. So you have to come up with alternative solutions, and a lot of being a strong individual player in NA is about finding these alternative solutions. And a lot of the times it's go to boot camp in Korea, play against stronger opponents, try to retain kind of like what you learned from there, and then keep really good self-discipline in season so that you just remember and can visualize the mistakes. You can also, I always encourage players to watch POVs or odds as much as possible. This is a lot harder because they did it with ProView, and ProView was like a super useful tool for NA pros. But you can get all LCS pro teams have access to raffle files. So at the very least, you can watch the laning phase on the raffle files or the replay files from the pro matches from LCK. The other tools are obviously watching streams, right? Pro player streams. So those are things like this. You have to do a really good combination of visualizing what the correct play is and honing muscle memory. So you have to have a good combination of those things, and finding the correct combination, I think, is the biggest struggle because you can always get to the point where you're using, oh, it's more efficient for me to watch VODs as an excuse not to play solo queue. And you can
Mm-hmm.
also get to the point where it's like, oh, I'm playing a ton of solo queue, and then you're just practicing and reinforcing bad habits because you don't watch enough odds, right? So I think that that's one of those things that's diff- important to understand when you talk about like closing coaching philosophy. So I would say, for example, if you're coaching in NA, you probably spend a lot more time sitting with your pro players and watching VODs of other regions and other individual pros to help them learn fundamentals, as opposed to watching their own VODs. And then in terms of teaching like the overall strategy of the game, I think again, that really depends on the size of your staff. If your staff is very small, you're going to spend a lot more time on the things that affect every single player, which is like the macro decision making of the team. So we had a pretty small staff. We had two. So I think we probably spent a lot of time on the overall macro decision making compared to on a lot of the fundamentals than maybe we would have liked, right? So I think that it really depends on the resources you have available and the amount of time because having a positional coach in every role, as long as they're effective and actually know the role, which has been a problem in the past, right? can be really, really efficient because you have players getting constant individual feedback as well as the overarching head coach, assistant coach who are giving you overall macro focused feedback, decision making focused feedback in terms of like how the overall team operates together. So, yeah, it really kind of depends on the resources, the time restriction, and generally speaking, the region you're in has the TLDR in terms of like what your coaching philosophy is and what tools you use and are available to you. So,
Speaking of tools, wasn't Challenger's Queue, I think it's called,
Champions Queue, yeah.
Champions Queue, wasn't that supposed to be like all pros finish their scrims? They actually have a place where they can, work on their mechanics without all the downsides of NA solo queue. Um,
Yeah.
why did that not? Why did it fail? It seems like every split, the first week or two is great, and then afterwards it kind of tapers off and people don't play it.
So I think excuse me. I think Champions Queue is a really awesome tool. I think that more pros should use it and consistently use it. I think there was a combination of factors that led to it consistently kind of failing. One is it's a lot faster and more efficient to queue solo queue, like almost always. You'll have pros who you can watch their streams. They will queue for both Champions Queue and solo queue, and they'll just play whatever pops first, right? It's just you get more games if you're playing solo queue, typically speaking, and that is in part because even when you have every pro playing, it's still less people queuing up. So I think that that's one factor. Another one is a lot of pros expressed that they just were very fatigued from constantly having comms all day, right? Comms all day during matches or and during scrims, and then they didn't want to talk when they were playing solo queue. They just wanted to focus on themselves and their own individual mechanics. So they didn't necessarily want the pressure of queuing. Still queue muted, but obviously it annoys your teammates if they're really focused on the communicative experience and the team play experience of Champions Queue and really want to use all tools available to them to win the games. So you kind of have to think about it from that perspective. You can call it an excuse if you want to, but it's relatable to not want to every day
Mm-hmm.
do the Champions Queue experience. The other element of it was I do think, especially this year, when we had the difference in schedule, we had the 3 blocks and then the days would end at 8 p.m. And then people would just play solo queue at home, right? Because it's a really long day already, 8 hours of play already. Go home, play Champions Queue or play solo queue. Play solo queue is a lot less stressful, right? So I think that that was like part of it. The other part of it is going to be the thing that they don't talk a lot about, which is that the quality of games is very variable. When you have a high percentage of pro players and a low percentage of like high elo solo queue players, because you need to invite like the high elo solo queue players or the amateur players to fill out the lobbies because the queue times are so long. But also, if most of your server is like high level LCS players, then it will start to feel like the games are won and lost almost based solely upon which team has like the amateur ringer or the lower elo ringer. And that's not to say that all the amateur players invited were bad. A lot of them were actually quite good, which makes the disparity even worse, right? In the sense where it's like you
Mm-hmm.
have a few who are not quite at the level, and then constantly trying to filter those out and then getting the feedback from the players where it's like, oh, this level is too low or too high. And I can imagine that's just like a massive headache for Riot to sort out. It's like, where do you put the bar? Do you have to hand vet and have the Champions Queue Council vet every single person you invite? And then if you do that, does it become a big boys club where only the friends get in and all of
Mm-hmm.
the politics of it, right? So there was a lot of that happening. Again, you can call these things excuses, but these were the things that frequently came up, right? I think Champions Queue is a great tool, and it's a shame that it's dead. I think it's a major shame that it's dead. I think that even if it existed, though, the quality of Champions Queue is still not to the level of like Korean solo queue in terms of just the overall opponents available at an extreme high level. But I do think it is a massive shame, and a lot of the reasons are ultimately excuses. So, but I definitely also kind of get the perspective of um, the players who feel extremely fatigued, have worked extremely hard, and they just want a solo queue experience where they can focus on improving their own mechanics, right? So, yeah.
All right. My next question is related to something we talked about earlier on, like sort of fraud coaches or fraud analysts.
Yeah,
My first question is, what differentiates a coach and an analyst? Because we've seen a lot of
sure.
times where an analyst is acting like a coach, or
Yeah.
an assistant coach. You don't really know what their job is, and the analyst is doing everything. So, like, what's the difference? And does it differ team to team, or like how does that work?
Yeah, I think if you talk about what the titles are, sometimes it can be a bit of a gray area because again, like the coaching staffs aren't always completely efficient, right? So a lot of times you will have an analyst taking on more of a coaching role or a coach behaving more like an analyst. But what the role should be fundamentally, right, is the analysts are often working with data, and what it has kind of boiled out to more as the system has evolved and is more common team to team. It's like the analysts are focusing a lot more on data and pulling data, analyzing opponents for upcoming matches, doing math on builds, doing things that are helpful from that perspective, and then relaying the information either via text or short conversations to the players or to the coaches themselves. And then the coaches relay them to players if they feel like it's an item build that's going to be a hard sell or something, and the coaches might be more persuasive in getting the players to see the points, right? And then the coaches tend to be the ones who are interacting more heads on with the players and who can kind of give the experience of managing conflict and relaying overall game strategy and then also doing one-on-ones and talking to them more in depth about like what their thought process is and how to improve their gameplay from like a mental perspective or a decision making because I firmly believe that the best coaches coach decision making rather than just spewing as much facts about the game as you possibly can at a player's general direction. So it's really down to those types of things. And I feel like when you are an analyst, your job is kind of to find as much raw information as you can, condense it into a presentable way. And one of the skills of analysts that people don't really talk about much is um, being able to make things pretty because coaches and players have very short attention spans and so it's like if it's not pleasing to look at sometimes it gets disregarded unfortunately so I think that those are um, all I guess for me that's how I think of the difference at the moment and that's how a lot of most teams think of the difference currently in terms of the theoretical way it should work.
Did you guys have an analyst on EG?
Yeah, we had we had like a scout slash analyst who's works a lot on draft recommendations, etc. Who's Empire. Also helps. I think he does most of his work in off season because he is more of a traditional talent scout. And then you have also Bayora, who was more of your kind of opponent scout analyst who it's like, can you run the math on this build for me? Prepared like a nice, easy to use tool where you could put in items and it gives you the damage output and all of those things. So things like that. And then, of course, like you could also, he had a nice thing where you could enter the game time and you would see all the wards that the opponents placed at a given time in a game. So he had coded and made nice tools like that for us to use. So yeah, the more of the traditional analyst perspective. Yep.
Okay, you guys also used, I think it was powered by HP, their voice recognition, or
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. How useful was it to be able to like identify certain lulls or moments in comms where things could be clearer or less clear? Did Are voice comms like really that important? Um, if you're focused on decision
Mhm.
making, um, doesn't it just matter like okay the person calls the right call, what like sort of what effect does analyzing voice comms, considering you only have like a certain amount of time, what is it really more beneficial to work to analyze your voice comms versus like your late game decision making?
So I think it's interesting what you bring up because I think for me the fundamental difference between good comms and bad comms in game is something that I like to call like directional versus informational. So a lot of times people think about updates like oh jungle is here or I'm this guy has low HP, this guy is trolling, they're resetting here. This guy is missing. Like these types of comms they're very informative, but they're not necessarily directional. Because if you have everyone on your team just giving informative comms constantly, then you're never planning anything. And that is a problem. So it's like, okay, if this guy has low HP, then you say, I need you here on this wave. Like you ping your jungle, I need you here on this wave. We're gonna punish him and make sure he can't back for free, right? This guy has no mana. We just win. We can't let him back here. Here's exactly what I need you to do, or exactly what I want you to do. And then the jungle says, "Oh, I can't be there." Then and it's like, okay, this is game winning. Skip your camp now. These types of these types of comms are much more useful, right? Than the informative comms. So I think that those types of things are more what the tool was. We were constantly iterating and developing the tool on, and so we could use the tool to identify keywords like should or let's or these types of things that could tell us like how much of their information they're delivering is useful versus just informative, which informative isn't always not useful, right? Like if there's a big plan happening in top lane right now, then and the bot lane is just giving informative comms so we know what's going on. That's better than if there's like three plans happening on the map and everyone's making a plan at the same time and no one has no any idea what to do. So it is useful for analyzing those types of things, and that's kind of where the tool was headed. In terms of gaps in communication, which is where the tool started, it was I would identify who is you could identify things like who is more likely to shut down if a play goes bad, right? So let's say that top lane dies unexpectedly. Is my bot lane consistently just stopping talking when top lane dies, right? So does stuff like that happen? And that can be useful because you can give them the feedback that this is occurring, and then they realize, okay, I should really kind of work on this. Or you could give that feedback to, for example, the top laner. It's like, oh, you're saying this, and our AD carry is constantly mentally shutting down or stops talking when you die. Can you say something when you die to make sure that he understands that it's okay, we're fine, right? The game's not over. And that can be a way to kind of keep everyone focused on the next step, on what they can do now despite something bad happening, right? So it does help because as a coach, like you said, I'm often focused on like the overall big picture. I'm not going to notice like every time my support or my AD carry tilts when my top lane dies, unless it's just like a major glaring problem that's causing us to lose every game, right? So it's useful to have a tool that identifies those things so that you can just give like an easy feedback point and then that it doesn't become a problem in the future, right? So yeah.
That's interesting. One of the things I did notice, having played sports, is that we often yell a lot more. We're much more communicative in sports than in like esports and League of Legends. It
Mm-hmm.
feels like in team fights people are talking a lot, but whenever you listen to like voice comms and it's just like people laning, there's very little communication going on. Or like you said, sometimes just like, oh, this guy missed his E, he or something that's like not
Yeah.
really valuable. Um, I guess a lot of our rosters in North America
Mm-hmm.
have imports, and sometimes they can't really speak very good English.
Sure.
So then the next question is like, how do you communicate with someone? I don't think you played with any like imports that didn't understand English, at least in the LCS. But
No, I
um,
didn't. Yeah.
how do you then get this person on the same page as everyone else if you're trying to get your comms to all be like directional and not just informative?
Yeah. So in terms of imports, right, I think we are, and especially TSM kind of started this trend of being very hesitant to import players who don't understand the language. And I think it has less to do with in-game comms, which I think people emphasize way too much, and more to do with outside of game relations and how those operate. Because I remember we'd scrim dig, and these reviews would be like at 40 minutes long. And I just, what are they talking about? And you'd mention the coach, and they'd say, oh, the translator is taking a while. So you'd have those types of things, but one of the things that causes the most friction or the most frustration is when players cannot get their point across or cannot communicate well in review in terms of how they want to play or how they want to create a plan in certain situations. And then, of course, another thing there is if you come to the US and you don't have someone to kind of like help you understand where can I get food that reminds me of home, or where can I find friends to hang out with when everyone around me normally doesn't speak my language? How do I kind of get along with my teammates and kind of see them as people I can be honest with, right? And talk to openly when I don't speak their language. And those things I think matter way more than the in-game things because if you have like three people who are able to give directional comms and clear information and everyone else just kind of like says yes or no, then that's total. And you have two people who say yes or no, then that's totally fine. It's totally functional. And if the players just understand some game terms, which a lot of game terms can be sort of similar in English, depending on where you're from. Obviously, if it's Chinese, it's completely doomed. All the game terms are different, but um, a lot of languages, they're very similar. So it's not too difficult to kind of convey the in-game information. It's more about, in my opinion, the out-of-game stuff that causes so many problems. But anyway, in-game comms. I would say that in terms of downtime outside of fights, I think you get like the more hypey comms in fights, but do still hear a lot of talking. And it really depends on the team, right? I would say we had a lot of talkers on our team. A lot of people wanted to talk. I remember, actually, I talked to Ayla about this, like on the first couple weeks of scrims. He was like, Kelsey, everyone's talking. I'm gonna get my word across. Everyone's talking. So yeah, I think it's one of those things where it really depends on the team, right? In terms of like if you have a lot of directional voices or if you don't, and what problems arise. I think it's definitely way more stressful and frustrating to try to get a team of people who don't give directional information naturally to someone to step up and be a shot caller. That's a lot harder to do than to, but it can be broached with game knowledge because some people just aren't confident enough that their play is correct to make the statements. Whereas it's a lot easier to get a bunch of people who are talking a lot to calm down and understand like who's prioritizing what information. So yeah.
That makes sense. I guess my last topic that I want to talk about is academy. Obviously, we don't really
Yeah.
have academy like it was before from last year, but having worked with the tier two, tier three sort of talent pipeline, how different is it from coaching academy to coaching LCS? Is the player level, player dedication, player routines like how is that different?
Obviously my experiences are my experiences, but I always feel like the a lot of the times the academy and amateur players were are super enthusiastic about everything, right? And then it's just very easy to kind of have scrims and everyone talk about the game. Whereas I feel like LCS to an extent is a lot more about managing conflict and personalities and getting to a good solution there because a lot of players already have good, pretty decent game knowledge. So it's just more about getting to the point where everyone's on the same page and everyone is like happy about XYZ, these types of things. Whereas I feel like the enthusiasm with academy and amateur is much higher, generally speaking. And that won't always be the case, right? I'm actually really excited about a lot of the rosters because I know a lot of the players who are getting opportunities are really hungry. And then also some players who are returning are still very hungry and very excited, right? So that's not always the case, but I will say that the more experienced the players are, the more they care about things that aren't just the game. And that has good and bad aspects to it. I think we should encourage people to be well rounded and not eat, sleep, and breathe the game constantly because they'll have longer careers. But um, those are just one thing. And I would say that, again, because there's higher, like practically speaking, because there is higher game knowledge, it matters a lot more that you are a people leader as a coach for an LCS team than an academy team where um, you talk about this new shiny thing that you saw in LPL last night and everyone's happy. This is like an oversimplification, but I would say that this is a generally speaking, like kind of a big difference in terms of the attitude and what's going on because a lot more things are new at the academy and amateur level than they are at the LCS level. Um, and let's see, for me, I think it is very important that teams at least have some kind of relationship with the amateur ecosystem or the NACL ecosystem because it is very difficult to kind of think of a long-term strategy for your roster if you don't have relationships with players that you can kind of develop or hone in a way that you think will make a good future because at least like we were going to draw very heavily from our previous NACL team. And I can't imagine what building a roster this year would have been like if we didn't have one. So that's going to be a very interesting product problem to tackle, I think, in the future in terms of how people are going to bridge those gaps. So we'll see how it goes.
Um, in sports, a lot of times your academy and your main roster are
Mhm.
very much integrated. And I think when LCS
Yeah,
franchise and they had the requirement for academy, that's sort of what they envisioned, where like
yeah.
you could actually scrim your academy team and it would be
Mhm.
competitive and you'd be able to like hyper focus on something instead of telling them what to pick and what not to ban so that you can actually practice and sort of hide certain strategies. Um, did you do that on EG, like your first split when you still had your academy, your full academy roster? And what are some reasons that we don't really see teams do that or fully utilize them? I think C9 is notorious or famous for like really utilizing, and some people even say like their academy rosters often are like top five LCS.
Um, but I think it really depends on the strategy of your academy versus program because if it's is explicitly to provide good internal practice for LCS, you'll build it with very different players. At least traditionally in the past, I think right now the gap between academy and LCS closed considerably. At least NACL and LCS, and I think a lot of that has to do with promotions finally happening, which is exciting. And I also think it has to do with just more development over time and more access of the tier two to higher level tools for improving. Like I remember when I came to Academy in 2019, a lot of the players didn't even know like how many creeps to freeze a wave. And this isn't like every Academy player, right? But a lot of the brand new ones that hadn't played Academy before. That is no longer a problem. You talk to any amateur player right now on it who's played in NACL OQs, I guarantee they know how many creeps to freeze wave. So, like, it's just a matter of evolution over time, and I think that was kind of one of the biggest things is just because our server quality, which we already talked about, is just so poor at this point, or was just so poor. The level of like bottom of pure rookies compared to the level of a lot of the players coming from other servers who had played for many years, you just couldn't scrim internally, right? It just didn't work. But now, unfortunately, when we have academy kind of no longer as a requirement, I think now it's much more realistic and much more practical to do internal scrims because the level has shrunk a lot more. So I think that the gap between the levels, excuse me, has shrunk a lot more. So it's a little bit unfortunate that that's the case. And I'm worried that the gap will widen again now that kind of these academy teams aren't given full time resources because with the amount that even the NAC the LCS affiliate NACL teams are able to pay their players is just so much lower. There's no way you can do it full time without other financial support, either from your family or maybe you have a partner or something like that, or you have to do like a full time job or a part time job, and then you can't fully focus on league and improving all the time. So I think that that's going to be an issue going forward that may cause the gap to widen again, unfortunately. So that's something that I think is very important to actively look for solutions for if we want longevity of the LCS and we want to continue to see player promotions. So, yeah.
All right, thank you very much. And that was very insightful, especially for someone who I've played a lot of sports growing up, and I've seen a
Yeah.
very very different structure for like what is coaching and how base players are treated and the respect you have to the code. Like very rarely are you know do you have a player run team in sports
Yeah.
versus unless you're like the Golden State Warriors or something.
Yep.
So it's definitely very different. Where can people find you now that obviously EG sold?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much anywhere. You can find me KARONMOSER, Karen Moser. Um, I will be trying to stream again in a bit, I think probably just to keep up with that and to get back into that. I'm down to just take a little time off, do some content, etc. So that's something to keep out for. But YouTube, Twitter, Twitch primarily, same tag. Otherwise, if anyone wants to talk tier two, especially in NA, that's kind of where I've always been super passionate. So, happy to have any conversations. I've been talking to a couple teams in the offseason just about how their rosters are shaping up and really excited to see how NACL works going forward. So, look out for that. Otherwise, going to be rooting for the boys who would have been on EG. So feel free to follow Shaden, Zerdy, King, who all had dribbles with us, and then of course Rosvon, who was absolutely fantastic coach to work with this year. So yeah,
All right, thank you, and hopefully we see some more narrative wake episodes.
yeah, we'll see about that. All right,
All right, thank
nice to
you.
meet you.
Nice to meet
Good
you.
chatting.
All right,
Mhm.
bye.